Welcome to Project Catalyst, an economic development podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, Chief Marketing Officer at Maynard Nexsen, and I'm joined here today with Tom Brinkley. He's an economic development attorney in our Birmingham office. Good to see you, Tom.
Good to see you too, Tina.
Well, we have electric vehicles on our minds today, and we will be talking more about this industry with Mike Oatridge. He's the Executive Director of the Alabama Mobility and Power Center, also known as AMP. AMP was established in November 2021 in partnership with Alabama Transportation Institute, Alabama Power Company, and Mercedes-Benz as a research and workforce development center meeting the needs of the emerging electric vehicle market. Mike worked as an executive for Honda Motor Company for more than 30 years. Retiring in 2021 as Senior Vice President of Honda Manufacturing of Alabama. After retiring, he founded Strategic Workforce Solutions, developing public and private partnerships to secure more than $3 million in funding to develop ALEX, the Alabama Experience. It's an immersive and interactive way to learn about living and working in the state. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us, Mike. First, let's start by talking about the AMP Center and why there's so much focus on the thriving EV market.
Sure, I'd love to. I think the thing that's misunderstood with the EV market right now is it's not just about electric cars. It's about the entire ecosystem to support those electric cars, which runs from mining and refining materials to battery production, to vehicle production, to recycling, the power grid. Basically, it's all of the things that need to be in place to allow an electrified transportation to occur. So the AMP Center is really focused on doing research that drives economic development. So recently, Benchmark came out with a forecast that there'll be about $1.6 trillion of CapEx in the battery industry alone. So all the things I mentioned, only the battery industry is about $1.6 trillion. So the AMP Center is really focused on doing use-inspired research. What I mean by that is industry is struggling to overcome a lot of the hurdles that come along with electrification. So it's a perfect opportunity for a university which has a lot of research capability to provide research capability to that industry and then really incentivize the companies moving into this region, because not only of the state incentives, but also the workforce and the research capabilities that they maybe couldn't afford to provide on their own.
So, Mike, thank you again for joining us today. As you know, I'm very excited about AMP and all that you all are doing. It's really a unique institution for Alabama. So the average consumer out there thinks about the vehicle itself when it comes to EV. So help us drill down a little bit more in particular on what AMP's focus is on the component parts that go into the vehicle, the infrastructure that is part of the factor of the EV market in the state and in the country. Help us understand that a little bit more about what AMP is doing in that space.
Sure. And as I said earlier, AMP's really focused on doing research that drives economic development. And the starting point of all of that is being able to have some confidence in the growth of this market. So we have basically four areas that we really focus on at the AMP Center. The first one is consumer behavior forecasting. So how do we more accurately understand when somebody's going to buy an electric vehicle so we can understand the scaling of this entire industry and also the timing of that scaling. The second one is battery research. So lithium-ion batteries have primarily been produced overseas. About 73% of all lithium-ion batteries today are produced in China. So if we're going to domesticate this industry, we have a huge gap in research capability and knowledge. So we built out it's about a $30 million total, including the building and the investment, in building a world-class battery lab, which will be able to take raw materials like graphite and lithium and other materials like that, synthesize them and build batteries from scratch, allowing our not only innovation breakthroughs to happen in the battery manufacturing space, but also gain a lot of knowledge. But a battery without the power to power that battery doesn't really do much good. So the next lab is our power research lab. So this is really where the partnership with Alabama Power came in. We have basically a 1.25 megawatt power source. We have a microgrid. We have solar arrays. We have level 1, 2, 3 chargers. And we're able to do research through a very complicated switchgear on 240 volt, 480 volt AC power or 800 volt DC. What that means is residential type housing type power, industrial type power, and completely off grid solutions. For example, if a hurricane hit, you know, Florida right now and there was a lot of electric cars, how would we get those cars out? That's through a DC solution or a solution that does not require being hooked up to the grid. And the fourth, in my opinion, the most important out of all these is taking all the knowledge from those first three research centers and creating curriculum, understanding where the gaps are in people's knowledge. So we have a very robust education system in the United States, but as I said earlier, we've never really had a battery industry. We've never really had an electric car industry. So there's gaps in those research or in that curriculum, and we're filling those gaps one by one and making sure that we have all of the components to be really attractive to a company that's looking to move into the southeastern region.
And Mike, you talked earlier about forecasting tools. How is AMP using those tools to predict the product mix and the priorities in the market?
Sure. So first of all, most people don't understand, but when you look at those curves that say, hey, we're going to have 30% of our cars sold are going to be electric by 2030. If I ask the question to almost anybody, the answer, do you believe it or not? The answer is almost no, I don't believe it. And that's why we're seeing all this volatility in the market. That's because that's a regulatory-based market. So the CAFE regulations dictate that we have to create cars as a fleet average that get 54 miles per gallon by 2025. So car companies did almost everything but electrify. They made the panels of your car super thin. They put in 4-speed transmissions to 10-speed transmission. They put that idle stop switch in your car that most people can't stand. But the last thing they did was electrify. And they're electrifying because the regulations tell them they have to. But that's not a good way to predict consumer behavior because I'll just ask the question to you. If gas was 20 bucks a gallon, would you be considering an electric car? The answer is going to be yes all the time. So the anxieties that are pushing people towards or away from electric cars, like gas prices, like charger availability, like price parity between electric car and gas car, and there's about 20 of these. We took all those and we studied those, and then we bounced that across the registration data of electric cars in the state. And from that, right now in the state of Alabama, we can predict electric car consumer behavior with about 98% confidence. Unfortunately, when that spreads into Georgia and the surrounding states, it drops because there's slight differences. So we're working out those differences and we're running about 75% confidence when we do the southeastern region. Our goal is to get to 100% of the entire nation and be able to predict very accurately. But if you think about it, now I understand when people will buy cars and how many cars they'll buy. That allows me to do things like forecast workforce requirements, raw material requirements, battery manufacturing requirements. That's kind of all on the front side. But also, I can now also predict the end of life of an electric vehicle and say, when will those batteries be prepared for recycling, where we're going to recoup all those materials back in? So that tool, which we call Evolve, really helps develop kind of that longer term strategy of how we will get to some saturation of electric cars in a very big market that is the United States.
So Mike, what's unique about AMP from what you're telling us is not only you covering the research side and the workforce development side and the curriculum side, but also helping recruit industry to the region. And it's my understanding that AMP has been involved in close to 10 projects with billions of dollars of investment out there. How does AMP work with the Alabama Department of Commerce, with AIDT, with other local economic developers? And when is AMP typically brought to the table? Because I think that makes a fascinating story in and of itself.
Yeah, it's a very unique strategy. So without attracting industry to the state, all the work we'll be doing has no meaning. So we said that's a really important component. So about a year ago, we got together with people from the Department of Commerce, people from Economic Development Partnership of Alabama, AIDT, the power companies, even some construction companies and some others. And we started to come up with a targeting method to say, what kind of companies are best suited to try and recruit to Alabama in this space? So you might say, hey, we should go after a huge battery factory. That sounds great. A huge battery factory requires about 1,000 acres of very flat land. Well, I just excluded almost all Alabama. So what we kind of went through and said, okay, where are all the opportunities? And where Alabama is really well suited is for the supply base for the battery manufacturing. So Alabama has the largest deposit of natural graphite in the lower 48 states. There's a starting point. So how do we then recruit these businesses? We literally go through a list of companies and we kind of do a venture capital type analysis on those companies and say, what's the likelihood of them expanding? And then we go through a lot of analysis. Are they a fit for Alabama from logistics point of view, from educational attainment point of view, from workforce availability point of view? And therefore, when we sit down with those companies, very honestly, they're a lot of time they're blown away because we say, here's what your workforce is going to look like. Here's a site that you're going to need. And we've been asked, like, how did you know my business plan? And it's because we've done the upfront work and trying to making sure that they have those capabilities. But where AMP really plays in now is they also have a lot of gaps. So for example, if you wanted to start selling lithium to, LG batteries, you can't show up at their front door with a bag of lithium and say, hey, do you want to buy this? They want to see your lithium in a battery. And then they want to see that battery functioning, and then they say, okay, it performs or it doesn't perform. The problem is there's very few places in the world where you can go to that kind of job shop to have a battery made. So that's why this links back to one of those labs, that battery lab, where now we can provide a service to that company that they can't get anywhere else and really make the state of Alabama and the region very attractive for attracting some of that CapEx I talked about earlier.
So, Mike, you obviously talked about a lot about Alabama and the focus of AMP in the state of Alabama. Tell us a little bit more about the regional focus of AMP. Are there other states that AMP is working with? Because obviously Alabama has certain supply chain factors in its favor. In other states, maybe have other factors in its favor. Tell us about other states that AMP is working with and how are they brought to the table?
Sure. So after we finished our strategic plan for AMP, we've quickly realized that it's probably too much that we've bit off. But the problem was we couldn't really shed any part of it because they're all interweaving with each other. So we kind of started thinking, how could we involve the sister states? So we talked to Mississippi and to Georgia, and we talked to their governments, we talked to their power companies, we talked to UGA and MSU, and we said, hey, should we try and figure out how to do a regional approach to this? The general idea was yes, but how? Of course, to set something up like that, it's very difficult, and it's a tri-state region, so it requires a lot of coordination. So we applied to the National Science Foundation for a Regional Innovation Engine grant. That grant would give us $1 million of funding to start setting up the planning to create this long-term organization to drive economic development growth in the region utilizing research. We got that level 1 grant or that type 1 grant, and we're now in the process. In February, we'll finish the application for the type 2 grant, which would then create Magnet as a standalone 501c3 with its sole purpose is to drive economic development throughout the region by doing research and development and workforce development, also informing policy. So that would then give us $160 million over 10 years to really sustain this type of activity and allow the regional approach to take hold. My opinion, that's the only way this will work. The components that go into a battery, one state cannot absorb that into their economy. So therefore, by doing a regional approach, we provide a really good platform for the industry to say, hey, I can do this because there's enough workforce over these 3 states, there's enough land over the 3 states, There's enough incentive programs across the 3 states to really make a big difference here. And you may hear, or you may have heard that the southeastern region is becoming known as the battery belt. That's because, about 3 to 4 million cars are produced in the southeastern region. As I said earlier, we already have a lot of graphite. We have lithium that is available from the Smackover Basin through Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So really what we ended up with is a kind of a match made in heaven that made a lot of sense. And then foundationally, we're utilizing the strengths of the states to, individually, we probably couldn't make a big difference, but collectively, we can really tell a story that really makes sense to companies looking to, locate or relocate.
I'm just saying my hat's off to you in working with other states, because obviously that's a little easier said than done. And but regionally, the Southeast is obviously a lot stronger than any one state. So congratulations on that.
Well, you mentioned workforce earlier as it's a huge component with whether or not a company wants to locate somewhere. How are you seeing those workforce needs being met from either the university or the surrounding tech schools in training a new workforce for this type of industry?
Yeah, I got a little smirk on my face because that's working with the 3 states is hard. Trying to figure out workforce is way harder. uh, So what we've tried to do, so from that Evolve tool, we now can have a better idea of when we believe people will purchase electric cars, and therefore we understand batteries and so on and so on. Therefore, we can understand workforce. So from capital investment projections, we can say, hey, for every whatever $1 billion of capital investment, we know it's going to bring this many jobs. But the problem is that we can do that fairly easily, and we can say, hey, in the southeastern region in 2030, we're going to need 35,000 jobs. But the problem is, what skills do they need? Has always been the problem. So we really tried to find out. So literally, I phoned people I knew that worked in the battery industry, and we had somebody who used to have a relationship with a battery company overseas. And we tried to phone and say, hey, what does your workforce look like? And they kind of laughed at us like, that's our competitive advantage. We're not going to tell you. So we work with the Business Intelligence Center to kind of say, well, how can we find out on our own? And we found out that there is availability of data that we took a couple different approaches. So we know, for example, Tesla has a battery factory in Nevada. We know that LG has a battery factory in Commerce, Georgia. And we kind of started scattering these all over the place. And we went and we dropped a pin on a map on top of those factories. We then drew a 45-minute circle, a commute circle, and we pulled all the educational attainment data from all of the people that work in that 45-minute circle. The likelihood that you commute more than 45 minutes is very, very low. Therefore, we said, we have a pretty good representation of where they're pulling from. When we aggregated all the data, we ended up with a very interesting outlook, but we can tell you how many electrical engineers, how many people have doctorates, how many have masters, how many high school. And we then kind of did a test because I went back and I phoned somebody I knew and said, hey, I think this is what the workforce would look like. And literally they said, how did you know what our workforce looked like? And we said, ding, 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 we got it right. That was a really important step because now it gave us kind of an aiming point. It says, hey, these are the skill groups. So what we're doing is now going through and looking at who's in these curriculum programs at the universities, and then being able to understand where the gaps are so that we can then say, hey, we have a lot of mechanical engineers and maybe we're over-indexed to mechanical engineers. Therefore, for marketing, we really need to push towards chemistry or metallurgy or whatever it is where that gap is, to be able to long-term support an industry that could bring a lot of financial viability to a lot of families in this state and the region.
So, Mike, as of the date of this airing, we just had a presidential election, and we now have a new president. Stepping back and looking at kind of the macro EV market itself, tell us, in your view, about some of the challenges that you see in the EV industry. How do you think that this new administration may affect the supply chain or the buyers and the suppliers overall, as best you can, understanding we're now in day 2 of this new election?
Yeah, maybe day 2, but I think I've been asked this question for the last year pretty heavily. So It's a really interesting question. And I think the reason I find it interesting is that I already described that a regulatory-based market is very, very volatile and very, very difficult to invest in because you don't believe the data. If we move to a market that is consumer driven, in other words, products and services that the consumer wants, then regulation doesn't matter anymore. And then it's just a normal free market type environment. That's why we focused that way from day one. We said nobody's going to buy an electric car because somebody told them to. They're going to buy an electric car because they want to. So how do we change that dynamic? Also, I think a lot of people are maybe not as knowledgeable on the development cycle of a brand new vehicle. So when the car companies, which all of them have to some extent, started investing, not only, normally they have they'd refresh a car, but it's the same engine in that car, maybe for, 20 years with very small modifications. When electrification came along, people had to create a whole new powertrain. They had to create a whole new chassis. They had basically to create a brand new car. The development cycles of cars, can range between, 4 or 5 years to 10 to 12 years. So if you think about it, these cars have been in development for a long time because the regulation says you have to, otherwise you're going to get fined a whole lot. So the car companies have committed. Now, can they make adjustments? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, the market's not going to go away purely because we're too far along to really make that change. So I think, consumer behavior is a very interesting thing. Like in California, Alabama, less than 1% of the cars sold are electric. In California, 25% of the cars sold are electric. But there's also that once you get to that 25%, that means you likely know somebody who drives an electric car, and you kind of get that feeling, well, if they can do it, why can't I? It can't be that hard. And the problem is when you're at less than 1%, the likelihood of you knowing somebody is not very high, and therefore you're much less likely. So how do we adopt a different point of view, which is produce products that the consumer is asking for, that this consumer wants, and then this will become a market like all markets. So at the end of that, a big long sentence, I don't think it matters.
Well, that 1% number is pretty stark compared to California's 25%. That is for sure. Thank you so much for being with us, Mike. We have run out of time, but we appreciate you being here. Hopefully we'll have you back again and talk more about how the EV industry is evolving. It's certainly moving at a really fast pace. And thank you for what AMP is doing to bring it all together. And thanks for joining us too, Tom. Good to see you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Mike, for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Enjoyed being here today.
We'll see you next time on Project Catalyst. Project Catalyst, an economic development podcast, is a Maynard Nexon and NP Strategy production. To learn more about the podcast and subscribe, visit thecatalystpod.com or find us on your favorite podcast platform.